The year is only 60 days old. During that time, there have now been 92 homicides here in the District of Columbia.
Apartment complexes where working people lived became crack houses.
The saying in Washington these days is that D.C. doesn't stand for District of Columbia, but for Dodge City.
When the crack epidemic hit, the D.C. Police Department wasn't ready for it.
Friday, midnight, Washington, D.C., 1988. Sirens wailed through blighted streets just a few miles from the White House. Another flash of blue lights reflects off brick walls scarred with bullet holes. In the shadows, residents peek from barred windows as detectives step around bloodstains. It's become a far too grim routine. Almost every night, street scuffles end with a burst of gunfire.
Right now, you still hear that? This is a war zone. You talking about Iraq? D.C. is a war zone.
And yet another young person turned to a corpse. From alleyways to vacant lots, the fights are often over nothing. This is Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s, a city under siege by the crack cocaine epidemic. And by early 1989, the nation's capital had earned a new ominous title, Murder Capital USA. The homicide rate here more than doubled in barely a year, far outpacing other cities. The headlines tally bodies like box scores, and before the summer, there had been 120 killings already in a city of only 650,000, and nearly 60% of those murders were drug-related. It had gotten so bad that the local news ran a nightly segment updating the day's body count. In 1988, D.C. recorded 372 homicides, shattering its previous record from 2 decades earlier. By 1991, murders peaked at 489 in a single year. Statistically, that gave Washington a homicide rate 3 times higher than New York, Los Angeles, or Miami had ever seen. The world's eyes were on the U.S. Capitol for all the wrong reasons. As Mayor Marion Barry stated, once a city gets a name like the murder capital, you can't get rid of it. But what had turned Washington streets into killing fields almost overnight? Crack cocaine, a cheap, potent new form of smokable cocaine that hit D.C. around 1985 and 1986 and spread like wildfire. A single rock could cost anywhere between $5 to $10, making a cheap high accessible to anyone. Demand surged, leading to an explosion of violence that shocked a city already familiar with crime, but unprepared for the level of madness that crack brought. In the communities ravaged by crack, even the kids grew up surrounded by scenes of life and death. On the east side of the Anacostia River, a cluster of neighborhoods in southeast D.C. became ground zero for the crack wars. Ward 7 and Ward 8, places like Anacostia, Congress Heights, Berry Farm, Benning Terrace were areas long struggling with poverty and neglect. Now they were the epicenter of a drug-fueled bloodbath. In 1989, nearly half of D.C.'s murders occurred east of the Anacostia River, in the impoverished 6th and 7th police districts. Across the water, in the manicured cul-de-sacs of northwest D.C., gunfire was a distant rumor, but in southeast, it was the nightly soundtrack. See, in southeast D.C., the Anacostia River too often serves as the dividing line between them that's got and them that's trying to get.
The shooting war over the valuable street drug markets is concentrated across the Anacostia River from Capitol Hill in the city's poor neighborhoods. Drug violence has left these neighborhoods in turmoil.
Streets like Hannah Place are just too often simply dead ends. Once a quiet little cul-de-sac, by 1989, as one resident put it, Hannah Place had become an island in a sea of crack. Drug crews took over the adjacent park and vacant lot, with dealers rolling through on ATVs and 4x4s, bringing in product and cash. Basic city services like trash pickup and streetlights, already lacking to begin with, all but vanished during the worst years. In July 1989, a 33-year-old mother named Rhonda Anthony was killed by a stray bullet while sitting on her front porch at 2:30 a.m. Only after that tragedy did a parade of officials, the mayor, police, sanitation crews finally descend on Little Hannah Place, mowing knee-high weeds and installing lights that residents had begged for all along. All over Southeast, the story was the same. Longtime residents watched their blocks transformed into open-air drug markets. On many corners, the dealers outnumbered the cops. In the Greenway neighborhood of Southeast, over 15 homicides and dozens of shootings occurred within a few blocks in 1993 alone. Dealers took over playgrounds, stoops, and storefronts as retail spots. Liquor stores, go-go clubs, takeout carryouts, and simple parking lots all became a backdrop for hand-to-hand sales. At night, the glow of crack pipes lit up alleyways like fireflies. Customers cruised in from Maryland and Virginia drawn to the frenzy. Dealers would flash hand signals to flag down driver or buyers, advertising the type and price of rocks they offered, while lookouts would whistle warnings if they saw police coming. With so much business at stake, competition was ruthless. Deputy Police Chief E.J. Spurlock said this town is like an infant when it comes to crack. Nobody's been able to get a hold of it. There were no clear territories or truce lines. Every block was up for grabs, and betrayal and gunfire were inevitable. On one of those southeast nights when death moved with purpose, October 1988, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and exhaust. And by sunrise, 3 souls from different worlds were gone. Booby Clark, 17, riding shotgun in a Volvo, took a bullet to the face. Butch Leak, the driver, was found dumped with a hole in his gut. Michael McGirt was chased down filled with rounds in a park Chester hallway. Witnesses remember the killers. 5 young men in black ski masks, rolling through Berry Farms like they owned it, hunting their marks without a care in the world. They didn't hide, they didn't miss. Residents stayed locked inside after dark, knowing the neighborhood had been turned into a dumping ground for bodies, a place where narcotics, addicts, and gunplay ruled the night. Cops later traced the carnage back to a Mount Vernon, New York drug boss running a 6-block empire in Berry Farms. When police kicked in his door, they found coke, cash, shotguns, a machine gun, and a photo of McGirt with a black X slashed across his face. In his world, debts were paid in blood. The word was simple. If you owed him, you died. Booby was just in the wrong car at the wrong time, swallowed up in a Wild West vendetta where the only law was the trigger. Incidents like that sent a chill through a city, but children weren't even spared. In September 1993, 4-year-old Lana Smith was playing in a southeast schoolyard when she was fatally struck by a stray bullet during a gang shootout. The public outrage was so intense that the community leaders begged the governor to send in the National Guard. A special police task force named Red Rum was deployed instead. Even before that, countless youth had been caught in the crossfire. By August 1988, 218 juveniles had been wounded by guns or knives in D.C., and 16 of them killed.
You know, it ain't even safe around here no more, man, like it used to be. Can't even sleep in your house, man, without somebody shooting outside or selling drugs in front of your house or something like that.
By the late 80s, D.C. was running on a different kind of currency, pure uncut chaos. See, the crack game wasn't some well-oiled machine with bosses in silk suits calling shots from the shadows. Nah, this was street-level capitalism at its rawest, a hustle fueled by greed and paid for in blood. Corners weren't claimed with contracts, they were taken with gunfire. See, out in LA or Chicago, you had the gangs holding steady lines, codes carved into the concrete. But here was a vacuum, wide open begging to be filled, and every young hustler with a pistol and a pulse thought he was next in line. Local boys fresh off the block, slick out of town and smelling opportunity, they all dove in, fighting over customers like starving dogs over a bone. There were no rules, no mercy, no truce, just the streets deciding who lived long enough to make another sale. Within this time period, dozens of neighborhood-based crews had sprung up, each trying to dominate a few blocks or a housing project. They adopted names like the Simple City Crew, 37th Street, R Street, Newton Street, Parkview Crew, and many more. Their members were often teenagers or barely 20, brandishing 9mm handguns and AK-47s, a lot different than the knives or the revolvers that the old heads used to have. These crews turned apartment buildings into fortresses, similar to the Carter in New Jack City. Berry Farms dwellings, a sprawling public housing project in Southeast, became notorious for open gun battles. Benning Terrace, nicknamed Simple City, saw 9 crew-related homicides in 1994 alone, and even a daytime ambush-style shooting at a swimming pool that wounded 6 children. The shooting stemmed from a beef between the Simple City Crew and the Eastgate Gang. For many, the crack game offered what society didn't: quick money, status, and a feeling of power. By the 80s, Washington was the city of stark contrast, a majority black city with a large black middle class, yet also deep concentrated poverty. The gleaming federal buildings and affluent enclaves existed only minutes away from poverty-stricken ghettos. Washington had fewer blue-collar jobs or pathways upward than older industrial cities. No factories, no working class, only the poor on one hand and an enormous middle class on the other. In the 1980s, as the drug economy boomed, a street dealer could make it a day what a minimum wage worker made in a month. For some young men, it wasn't a hard decision. See, crack was the easy buck until the bullets started flying. By the late 80s, nearly 2/3 of DC murders were tied directly to the drug trade, up from 21% a few years earlier. Amidst the chaos, a few kingpins managed to rise above the street corner fray, at least for a short time anyway. The most infamous of them all was Rayful Edmond III, a drug lord whose name still echoes in D.C. history.
The estimates of law enforcement is that the Edmonds organization was distributing approximately up to 20 to 30 kilos of cocaine per week here in the District of Columbia. If you look at that, that's about 100 kilos a month. That's over a ton a year of cocaine and cocaine base.
By 1988, 24-year-old Rayful Edmond was already a legend in the city's underworld. He ran a large and sophisticated cocaine empire that pumped an estimated $2 million worth of cocaine and crack onto D.C. streets each week. His crews operated mostly in the neighborhoods around 8th Street, Northeast, and Trinidad, but his product, cheap $20 crack rocks, flowed citywide. It was said that at the height of his reign, 1985 through 1989, he could drive through any quadrant of D.C. and spot someone smoking his supply on almost every block. Edmond flaunted a lavish lifestyle, custom-tailored silk suits, multi-carat diamond jewelry, and a penchant for courtside seats at Georgetown Hoya basketball games. Yet he also cultivated a Robin Hood mystique, handing out $100 bills to kids and sponsoring youth basketball leagues in his Northeast neighborhood. This mix of generosity and fear made Rayful a folk hero to some and a public enemy to others. Mayor Barry later reflected on Rayful's charisma, stating, "He was a young, likable guy. A lot of his friends had no idea he was involved in drug selling. Rayful had a lot of people who liked him and were very loyal to him. Loyalty, however, only went so far." Federal agents had been closing in on Edmonds as violence and addiction skyrocketed on his watch. Authorities would later link Rayful Edmonds' organization to at least 30 murders, from contract hits to deadly turf disputes, although Edmonds himself was never convicted of a violent crime. On April 15, 1989, a federal task force finally arrested Rayful Edmonds. His trial became the stuff of local lore. Unprecedented security measures saw jurors seated behind bulletproof glass and kept anonymous even after the verdict. Edmonds' reach was so feared that the judge barred the public from the courtroom entirely. In September of 1990, Edmonds was sentenced to life in prison without parole. While in prison, Edmonds continued orchestrating cocaine deals through jail phone calls, earning an additional sentence and eventually cutting a deal to become a government informant. But Rayful Edmonds' fall didn't close the book. It just turned his page to a bloodier chapter. The throne sat empty, and every hustler with ambition saw his shot. Some were from D.C., born killers like his protege Rodney Moore, ready to step into the light. Others came from outside, New York, Philly, Miami, dragging their own brand of heat into the city. Ones like Alpo Martinez, Harlem's smooth-talking kingpin, slid into town draped in gold and fast talk. He linked with Southeast's own Wayne Silk Perry, a man feared in D.C. streets for his murder game. With Alpo in the city, the bodies stacked up until his arrest in 1991. D.C. in the 90s was a lawless frontier, crews splitting, reuniting just to turn on each other again, while hitmen got rich selling death to the highest bidder. Through these years, ordinary citizens lived in terror. Those who could afford to moved out. Washington's population began to plummet from 606,000 in 1990 down to 529,000 by 1996. While the streets in D.C.'s poorest wards burned, the suits in power were selling slogans. Nancy Reagan smiled for the cameras, telling kids to just say no, waving the promise like it could stop a bullet or keep a rock out of a crack pipe. She toured the schools, stood on the White House lawn with choirs singing hope, all the while acting as if words alone could hold back the flood of drugs into the neighborhood. Ronald Reagan played the strong man, calling crack an uncontrolled fire and swearing that the war on drugs would stomp it out.
Today, there's a new epidemic, smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an uncontrolled fire.
While spending billions on cops, border checks, and drug busts, they bragged about convictions, tons of dope seized, and shiny new programs like DARE. But out in the neighborhoods, the fire kept burning, hotter than ever actually, while the speeches drifted away like smoke. Despite the First Family's urgings, crack usage soared, leading to Washington's police being overwhelmed while also being under-resourced, making it a struggle to stem the tide. In 1988, Congress created the first drug czar office, appointing William Bennett, who quickly singled out D.C. as a test case for the war on drugs.
What we want to do is to offer some help from the federal level, to get in, to help, and then to get out, so that the District of Columbia can run its own affairs.
But behind the speeches and photo ops, a darker truth was bleeding out. That same administration was tied to the very poison flooding the streets. Through the Iran-Contra scandal, CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contra rebels were allowed to move cocaine into the United States. The profits funded their war overseas, while the product waged war right here at home. On the local level, Marion Barry, Washington's charismatic mayor throughout the 1980s found his leadership deeply compromised. Barry had risen to popularity championing increased funding for community programs, but by the late 80s, rumors swirled of the mayor's own drug use. He was seen late at night, allegedly with known drug dealers, with some federal officials believing the mayor himself might be part of the drug problem. That theory proved true in January 1990, when Mayor Barry was arrested in an FBI sting operation. Agents caught him on camera smoking crack cocaine in a downtown hotel room as an acquaintance who had cooperated with the FBI provided the drugs. The image of DC's mayor became a symbol of the city's dysfunction. Barry's arrest and subsequent conviction for drug possession sent shockwaves through the community. The city tried to fight back, but it was like swinging at shadows. Cops hit the block hard, snatching up 46,000 bodies in 2 years, only to watch most of them stroll back out in days. Laws came down to kick hustlers out the projects and keep kids off the street at night, but courtrooms tied them up in red tape.
The curfew law was to take effect today over the opposition of Washington Mayor Marion Barry. But a Washington judge suspended the curfew temporarily, based on the assertion of the American Civil Liberties Union that the law is unconstitutional.
Even the Nation of Islam stepped in, providing security in some of DC's worst complexes, while churches prayed in the streets and kept the gyms lit for midnight basketball, providing youngins an alternative to the street at night. A few corners got quiet, a few lives got saved, but the storm didn't break. The killing wave just kept building, rolling towards the mid-90s before it even thought about slowing down. By the end of the 1980s, Washington, D.C. had achieved a dubious distinction. It led the nation in per capita homicides year after year. From 1985 to 1990, the district's murder rate dwarfed that of any other American city. To put it starkly, in 1990 through 1991, a Washingtonian was several times more likely to be murdered than a New Yorker or Angelino. The term murder capital became associated with D.C., a bitter irony in the seat of the federal government. Each year's end brought staggering numbers and heartbreaking headlines. 1985, 148 homicides, a temporary 20-year low just before crack hit. 1986, the uptick begins, 194 homicides. Len Bias's cocaine overdose death in June of 1986 in nearby Maryland sounded an early alarm. 1987 saw 225 homicides as crack supply and turf wars spread. 1988, 372 homicides, DC's highest ever, more than doubling in 2 years. That year, DC's murder rate edged out Detroit to rank #1 in the nation. 1989 saw 434 homicides, and by the end of '89, drugs were implicated in 60% of the murders. In 1990, 479 homicides, and by 1991, DC saw 489 homicides, the all-time peak. In just 1 year, 1 in 1,300 DC residents were killed. In the neighborhoods, some fought back, and some just simply held on. Grassroots groups like the Alliance of Concerned Men, led by former gang members, negotiated truces between warring crews in places like Benning Terrace. Ordinary citizens organized orange hat patrols, wearing bright caps and walking in groups to reclaim streets block by block. They planted flowers in vacant lots once littered with vows, determined to restore some normalcy. Slowly, the murder numbers did start to fall in the mid-1990s, thanks to a combination of community action, tougher policing, and frankly, the exhaustion of the drug war generation. By 1997, DC's annual homicides were back down to 301. Still high, but far from the crazy peak of 6 years earlier. The city was slowly but painfully recovering from the crack epidemic. Yet the legacy of the 1980s crack era remains etched into Washington's identity forever. The community trauma, the lost generation of youth, and the lessons learned about both crime and neglect continue to shape DC's policies and culture. It was a decade when the nation's capital became known less for monuments and presidents and more for the murder rates and drug lords.